Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Prachi Mishra, who is a professor in the Department of Economics and the director and head of the I6 Center for Public Policy at Ashoka University. Prior to joining Ashoka University, Prachi was the chief of the Systemic Issues Division and advisor in the research department at the IMF. We spoke about the current state of the Indian economy, India's growth trajectory, if the rupee is overvalued, India's current attempts at fiscal consolidation, and much more. We also spoke about trade, but this episode was recorded before the big tariff announcements on April 2nd. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi, Prachi. Welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here, Shruti.
I want to start by asking you to paint a picture for us about the current state of the Indian economy. And, there's the broader issue of structural transformation and where India is on that trajectory, and also where India is in sort of the current business cycle. And I don't even know what the current business cycle is. I don't know if is post-COVID or post-Trump, but we're recording this early April 2025. So if you can sort of set the stage for us, I think that would be super helpful for the listeners.
Sure. So, Shruti, if you want to assess India's current economic landscape, I think it's very useful to begin with some fundamental technical considerations regarding, how we measure and how we interpret economic performance. And as you rightly said, we have to distinguish carefully between cyclical and structural issues. So let me start, I think, with the state of the economy, Indian economy, in cyclical terms as I see it. The most recent quarterly GDP figure we have is for FY25 third quarter, which is October to December. So fiscal year in India, runs from April to March. So in the latest GDP report, the year-on-year growth in fiscal year 25 Q3, that is October to December quarter of 2024 calendar year, that was reported at 6.2%. And this is about roughly a 0.6 percentage point rise over the previous quarter of figure of 5.6%. So this is a substantial improvement over the previous quarter, and it was captured in the media and other reports you may have seen. I just want to say that, make a point, and again, it's a technical point, that this focus on year-on-year comparison between quarters. So basically, you're comparing, 5.6% in July to September quarter, and you're comparing that with 6.2% in October to December quarter. I think this, comparison across quarters in year-on-year numbers really requires very careful interpretation. So when, growth is decomposed, especially year-on-year growth is decomposed, both change in momentum. So change in momentum is, how the economy is actually, growing now. Is it very heated? It's not that heated. That matters, but base effects also play a role. And what are base effects? Basically, base effects are driven by how the economy was performing same time last year. So this 0.6 percentage point pickup, which I'm talking about, between July to September and October to December, it can be broken up between a pick in momentum, and that pick in momentum is about 5 percentage point or something, and that's 5.5 percentage points, and that's offset by a negative base effect of about 4.5 percentage point. And this negative base effect reflects the fact that the momentum was very strong same time last year. So the momentum in the economy is typically measured by what is called seasonally adjusted annual rate. So if you compare relative to last year, it is true that there's been a noticeable slowdown in economic momentum in India. So the seasonally adjusted annualized rate of GDP and market prices has declined from an average momentum of over 9% in 2023 calendar year to less than 6% now. And if you exclude this October to December quarter of last year, where, which did well, as I said, relatively well, The average momentum in 2024 was less than 5%. So we've had a 3 to 4 percentage point decline in momentum, which is quite huge. And this trend is really aligned. I'm sure you're following the news with recent corporate earning results, data on private consumption. And several analysts had been warning about this, coming slowdown for a while. So what are the reasons for this slowdown? And should we be surprised about it? I think it's important to remember that policy is an important driver. So if monetary policy in India, like in rest of the world, underwent a significant tightening over the last few years, so almost, 250 basis points, and considering, that there are lags in monetary policy transmission, especially in developing and emerging economies, these effects are likely still unfolding. Number two, fiscal policy also has seen tightening after the post-COVID stimulus which we gave. So fiscal policy has tightened by, say, 200 basis points in, if you think about, fiscal year 24 and 25. In addition, there have been regulatory measures, particularly those targeting consumer lending, and they have also contributed to the cooling effect. Therefore, this slowdown actually may be viewed as a cyclical adjustment, and at least partly driven by, the policy normalization following the stimulus measures which were implemented during the crisis, rather than indicating, structural economic damage. So what is an appropriate policy response to such a slowdown? It depends really on accurately gauging what is the extent of the slowdown. So as economists say, if the level of output is below potential, that indicates negative output gap, and that warrants policy intervention. And given if fiscal space is limited, and we can talk more about it as in the case of India, monetary policy itself, presents itself as a viable tool for adjustment. And as we've seen, RBI is already starting with an easing cycle, which is likely to continue. So this is basically the cyclical view of the economy.
Before we get into the structural views, I have one question on the cyclical nature.
Right.
So I want you to help us unpack the consumption element and the capital formation element a little bit, right? Private fixed capital formation has generally been much lower in India compared to trend. For the last sort of decade, it has been disappointing. And the jury said that India has this consumption-led growth, which of course COVID put a dampener on. Now, by disaggregating the numbers, can you tell us something about how, just the regular folks in the economy are thinking and responding to sort of post-pandemic cycle, or how they think about setting up a new business, or how they think about working on their farm and so on?
So see, as I said, if you compute, so if output is below potential, meaning output, there's a negative output gap. So basically, for macroeconomists, this means the demand is not sufficient. So that's why you have, say, RBI starting on an easing cycle, because demand is below potential. So potential you can think about as a long run supply. So 10 years back, when, you saw inflation rising and, you had a very high, so 10 years, around, when we had the taper tantrum, if you looked at most macroeconomic indicators, if you looked at inflation, if you looked at current account, they were all very high. And the output gap was positive. So the economy was overheated. That has, during the last 10 years, there have been a terrific improvements on the supply side. So basically, you've had the vast improvements in physical infrastructure, you've vast improvements in digital infrastructure. So basically, that means that while supply has improved, demand is now the binding constraint. And as you rightly asked, you rightly pointed out which part of demand is not sufficient. I think there has been catch up. I think it's been, of course, a lot of recovery. See, COVID happened, and then there were households had a lot of savings under their belt, and that they started spending post COVID, and that demand is sort of waning. Some of it has started to pick up now, if you compare, to pre-COVID, but I think the output gap is still negative. and RBI is trying to fill that gap.
So this is mostly basically people cutting back on like discretionary consumption, right? So if we triangulate, this also shows up in corporate earnings, which are low because discretionary consumption is low. It shows up in the pickup of small ticket loan items, as we can see, which are usually not business related. And it is showing in this year on year sort of cooling. So is that a good way to triangulate what's going on?
Yeah, I think it is. But I think if you want, to, structurally think about it, if you want to structurally think about it, you can think about it in terms of employment also. So you can, if you give more employment, higher wages, I think that's, real wage growth in India, if you look at PLFS data, for example, has actually been quite minuscule.
Yeah.
You can relate a deficient demand to also, weak real wage growth, which we are seeing for all categories of workers in the PLFS data. There's excellent work going on at the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. I think they may already have started. We have high frequency data on employment now. I think, if I'm not mistaken, PLFS is already quarterly, and it was going to be monthly going forward. So we don't have, a back series, but I think it's globally macro research is actually quite focused on employment and unemployment.
Yeah.
So, you use a lot of, where you are in the cycle. While what I talked about was based on GDP, most countries would look at it in terms of employment. I'm sure, we should be with with even higher frequency PLFS data, we should be able to do it. So basically, I think employment growth looks fairly good for both regular and self-employed workers. I think casual workers, they're about 1/4 of the labor force. They are facing negative or very low growth in jobs. And also, the rate of growth of self-employment is faster than that of regular wage jobs, which is, by the way, also a sign of weak labor demand.
Yeah.
So if self-employment is going, growing faster. So I think it's related to, so the demand deficiency to some extent may be related to the employment issue as well.
Yeah, so, this is a nice lead into where India is in the trajectory on structural transformation. India's been a little bit of an outlier, that standard view of the way, say, the old European countries developed and then, Korea and China and everyone developed is there's a mass exodus of workers from agriculture into industry. And as they grow richer from industry into services and the knowledge economy and R&D and so on. And India has not exactly followed that script in the last 30 years since liberalization. So one question is, how do you think about India's structural transformation? And, within that, where are we in the current moment?
Sure. Shruti, I think before we go into, the components of GDP growth, if you want to take a structural view of the Indian economy, I think let's get some, broader facts straight.
Yeah.
And again, I think technical issues are important, especially for analysts, students who are trying to look at the Indian economy. I think we have to be very careful about, some of the technical issues. So I think looking at absolute levels of GDP is very important rather than looking at growth rates, which we are always very focused on. And this is particularly important. Again, it's a technical point, but I think it's particularly important in periods proximate to a crisis, and especially an unprecedented one like the COVID-19, where the response to the crisis itself led to the global recession. Right? We were locked inside, and to deal with the health crisis. So the response to the health crisis itself led to the global recession. I think what I mean, let me again elaborate on the technical point. If any economy contracts during any recession by say 10%, it goes from 100 to 90. In the following year, if the economy grows by 10%, can we say, wow, the economy is really growing, at very high rates? This is a terrific growth rate. The answer is no, because, after the 10% growth rate, the economy would still be at 99, from 90 to 99, still 1% below the pre-crisis level. Had the crisis not happened with normal rates, say 5% for any economy, the economy would have been at 105. So you would need a growth rate of 17% to get the economy to a pre-crisis path. So bottom line, again, as analysts, as as students, as faculty, I think we have to be clear that, when an economy is recovering lost output after contraction, growth rates can be really misleading. I did some calculations for the Indian economy, to see where it is relative to a pre-pandemic trajectory. So had the pandemic not happened, let's assume very conservative growth rates. The Indian economy was slowing even before the pandemic, but let's assume a conservative growth rate of say 6% to project the pre-pandemic path. And, not, as I said, don't take into account the slowdown that preceded it. We have still not recovered the lost output from the pandemic fully. I think we have covered a lot, but there's still a gap. And my calculation suggests that, there's still about a 3.5% gap. And this gap underscores the need for more ground to be covered to fully recover the lost output. And by the way, this is true for most EMs. I think that would be, of course, it depends on the assumptions. But if you did this calculation for Brazil as well, assuming 2.5% pre-pandemic growth path for Brazil, you would still be below, 1.5% below its pre-pandemic path. Of course, advanced economies, they recovered, particularly the United States, keeping aside what is happening currently. I think we always talked about US exceptionalism, and US recovered very fast. I think if you compare bottom line, if you compare Indian economy to a pre-pandemic path, there's still a 3.5% gap which we have to cover. Another way to assess where Indian economy is structurally relative to our goals is relative to our goal of Viksit Bharat. Our target, again, that requires sustained focus beyond short-term economic fluctuations. A lot of press and media report focus on the short-term economic fluctuations, and, for good reasons. This goal of Viksit Bharat can, of course, have broader connotations beyond GDP. So, to include inclusive development, sustainable development. But I think if you want to...
growth.
Yeah, correct, job growth. But if you want to interpret it very, again, as a macroeconomist, very, matter of fact way that, narrowly, it's like in terms of an advanced economy by per capita income. What would India need to become an advanced economy by 2047? And based on the thresholds given by the World Bank. So let's assume for simplicity that those thresholds don't change. So in 2024, India's per capita income in nominal GDP terms is estimated at 2,700. If you do simple compounding, I think if India can maintain 8% growth in nominal per capita dollar terms, it would cross the upper middle income threshold, that is about 4,400 in 2031. And it would cross the high income economy threshold of 13,485 in 2045. And this is like very simple calculation. And then you can ask the question that what do these numbers imply for, real and nominal GDP, not GDP per capita growth in rupee terms. And there it becomes tricky because you have to make assumptions on population growth and you have to make assumptions on exchange rate depreciation. And I think every macroeconomist knows that, especially the latter, predicting movements in exchange rates is very hard. So if you make reasonable assumptions, say 1% population growth, 1% rate of depreciation, you would need a nominal GDP growth of about 10%. But each year, so if you assume 4% inflation consistent with our target, this would imply a 6% real GDP growth, but on a sustained basis.
Yeah, so 6% every year without exception, so it compounds.
Every year. So 6% growth aligns with India's average growth over the past 2 decades if you take a simple average. But sustaining it for another 20 years, that presents a significant challenge. You've seen the World Development Report on the middle income trap and what the challenge is. And only selected, so-called miracle economies have done it. You spoke about Korea. Korea is an excellent example of that.
No, but this actually, this is useful to get into because when we disaggregate further into India and start looking at some of the bigger states, if India were to follow the standard trajectory, right, that is grow like this at 6% and with all the assumptions of population and exchange rate and all baked in, one would automatically assume that the poorer states are the ones that are growing faster, right, than the richer states. In India, that's not true, actually. The poorer states are both poorer than the richer states, but are also growing slower than the richer states. So the states within India are also diverging, and the richer states are a smaller, have fewer people. So, but they're a larger share of GDP. So the 6% year-on-year trend also frightens me for that reason and seems a little bit unrealistic, because that means that Uttar Pradesh and Bihar have to unleash 7-8% growth of their state GDP year-on-year, which is simply not happening.
I think you've touched on an extremely important point, Shruti, about, when we got independence, basically, our forefathers had envisioned that you would have a more egalitarian society. You would have balanced development of different regions. And active state intervention was envisaged to reduce these disparities. And that's why, now we have had 15 finance commission, we have the former planning commission. Now the 16th is in progress.
Yeah.
Despite all this, divergence across states has increased.
Yeah.
And might have, if anything, assumed extreme proportions. And, I've written about it, and it's very close to my heart because I am from Bihar. No state exemplifies this other than Bihar, which is, so this article I wrote was titled Sub-Saharan India. Basically, Bihar fits in with the typology of a low-income sub-Saharan state in terms of economic indicators and standards of living. But it's not like any sub-Saharan, it's not like, it is actually comparable to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, like, Liberia, which had a number of civil wars, etc. So it's higher than Bihar's per capita income only is higher than Sierra Leone, Malawi, and Niger in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
And if you exclude Patna and Begusarai, the two,
then it's even lower.
Then it's even lower. So and this is at a point in time, but actually, as you correctly said, it's basically the divergence has increased over time. So Bihar accounts for like 9% of India's population, less than 2% of India's GDP. It's, current per capita income is, about $700. It's, it's comparable to Liberia, as I said, as one of the poorest, country inflicted by, civil wars. And what is even more striking is that, Bihar continues to lag other states in economic growth and development. So if you were to plot per capita income, you'll see that, the divergence with other states is increased. If you look at Karnataka and, if you compare like over 2 decades,
that graph, I've plotted it. It's a little scary, but for me, the Bihar, the relevant comparison is not even Karnataka. It feels like the relevant comparison is something like Odisha, which was quite poor and kind of at par with Bihar, at the time of independence and so on. But in the last 25 years, Odisha has done remarkably well in a way that Bihar and UP have still really lagged.
Right. So I did some calculations, like number of years it will take Bihar to catch up to some of the states.
Oh, wonderful.
And
I would be very curious to hear this stuff.
It would take 17 years for Bihar to catch up to Orissa.
Wow.
And 61 years to catch up to even half of all India average. Forget about, comparing with Gujarat or Karnataka.
And this is at current rates of growth.
Yeah, it's at current, rate of growth in Bihar, which is because the level is so low. Again, that's what I said, because the level is
matters.
So low, you cannot interpret, growth rates too much, because I think it's out, it is out of a low base. This is a, development across different states in Bihar, balanced development across regions. And why, despite having so many transfer mechanisms, we don't have, equality across states, and why is that not coming down? I think is really something we need to think through carefully. And it's related to all the things, you talked about manufacturing, you talked about services. I think there are, hardly any industries in Bihar. I think services is doing well. I think there is, especially health services, education services are all doing well. And, if you would think that, again, I'm giving the example of Bihar because I come from Bihar. If you look at higher educational, by the way, Bihar has improved a lot on ACER scores, so primary school enrollment. A higher education gross enrollment is still, or if you look at, learning achievement scores from national achievements, so NAS, they're all among the lowest. And the statistics, by the way, are appalling for a state, the rich history of education, as well as strong intent and aspirations of its citizens. You can, that is very evident I don't know if you've traveled through Bihar.
I have, and everybody wants to do well in the
Yeah,
standard
ever
exams and
exploding
10
number
standard
of
and become an IS officer and so on, right?
correct, and ever
It's
exploding number of
remarkable.
coaching institutions.
Yeah. I mean, your marriage prospects are terrible if you're not well educated in Bihar, which is how I really, that's the pulse for me on how much a society cares about education. And, if we think about Bihar as a country and not as a state within India, it's basically at this point a, semi-remittance economy. A lot of the Biharis actually have to leave Bihar to find work. I mean, this is both at the top end and at the bottom end. That is, the very low skill informal workers are going into construction in other richer states and urban areas. And the very elite sort of knowledge workers have to move to Bangalore or Bombay or something to find work. And a lot of the way Bihar works is that the family is left behind and it's a remittance economy, which is also interesting because the track record of remittance economy countries growing very fast and having a structural transformation into development has not historically been very good.
Yet, Shruti, Bihar has the youngest population in the country.
That's true.
Close to 60% of population are under the age of 25. Bihar reports the highest fertility rate, in the country at 2.98 if you look at the latest NFHS, much higher than the replacement rate of 2.1, meaning that, Bihar's population will continue to grow at a fast pace, much more than all India average. Many states have much lower fertility rates than replacement rates. That compounds Bihar challenges. But at the same time, I think it's even more urgent how to, it's for policymakers to think carefully about how we can seize Bihar's demographic dividend and, how we can spur economic growth and development in, comparatively brief period of time, because I think time is running out.
Yeah. Absolutely. And for compounding, time matters more than anything else. So on the overall picture of the structural transformation, I mean, I think you've made your point on the level issue very, very clearly. If we disaggregate, how does India do between the different sectors? Where has India shown the most growth potential? Where has it shown the least growth potential and so on?
Right. I think the big issue, as you're well aware, is the share of manufacturing in GDP has remained stagnant over the last 2 decades or so. See, India is ultimately a labor-abundant country, yet India's, manufacturing is increasingly becoming more capital intensive, and it's even its exports. We'll talk about trade in greater detail, but even its exports are becoming more capital intensive.
Yeah.
So basically, it means that, labor intensive manufacturing, the big policy question or the big implementation question has been, how to spur labor intensive manufacturing, which can both, that can help the manufacturing problem, but also most importantly, the employment problem of the country. Services definitely has seen services production as well as trade has seen phenomenal growth. Particularly, your current. If you look at our current account, Shruti, and again, we'll talk more about it when we talk about trade. But if you look at our current account, if you look at merchandise current account and the services. So basically, it's almost, services, had it not been for services, the current account would have been much higher. Services provides a big cushion to the Indian current account. So basically, currently the current account deficit is about $50 billion roughly. And $300 billion is the merchandise trade deficit, which is equal to, the surplus on the services and secondary income. Secondary income, actually, I think remittances, for example, is counted in secondary income. So 50 billion deficit is basically is only equivalent to the primary income deficit. So it's surplus on services and secondary income basically completely balances the merchandise trade deficit.
Yeah. No, you talked about trade, and that's a really big part of India's, lack of manufacturing pickup and so on. So again, before we get into specific trade policies on how that affects India's manufacturing sector or, labor and wage elasticities and so on, can you just give us a sense of how to think about India and its trade policy in the current moment. So the Cliff Notes version is, India was almost autarkic by the time 1950. In 1991, we famously have the Big Bang reforms. India starts towards liberalizing on the trade side, and tariffs systematically come down over the next 20 odd years. And in the last decade or so, there's been a bit of a U-turn on that. There is some back and forth going on sectoral parts where, the tariffs start going up. And now, there's a greater recognition that that's not doing very well for India or Indian manufacturing because exports become very expensive, especially with tariff inversion in certain industries. But also with the new administration in Washington, D.C., and, the upending of WTO and the old world order and now having country by country retaliatory tariffs or whatever the new regime is. But this is the regime as of April 2025. What is a good way to just think about where India is now before you walk us through the other parts?
Right. As you pointed out, I think this has been, the big global event is just shaping geopolitics, is the new US administration and the Trump tariffs. I like to think a little bit systematically about, what these are and, how much of it is, reality, how much of it is. So the way I think about it is, how much has been implemented on these Trump tariffs, how much has been announced but delayed implementation, and what is probable. I think 25% on steel and aluminum has been implemented, 20 percentage point increase for imports from China, and 10 to 25% Canada and Mexico. But that's very, these are small share of imports that are not covered by US, Mexico, Canada, the USMCA. So this is one, what has been implemented. What is ordered and not implemented? I think 25 percentage point additional tariffs on Mexico and Canada. I think the implementation was postponed for a second time. And then what is likely? I think April 2nd, I think by the time probably a podcast is out, we'll know about it. The whole thing about, reciprocal tariffs and the tariffs on critical imports, the 10%, at least 10% higher tariffs, 10 percentage points higher tariffs, and 25% on auto imports. So I think we need to think carefully about, what has been implemented, what's been ordered but not likely to be implemented, what is likely to be announced, say, next week. But again, even those, implementation may take time. So I think we have to be clear about that. And when we think about the macroeconomic impact, to think very systematically, I think we have to think about US, what the impact on US is going to be. It's not very clear. I think immediate impact, of course, low, higher prices, lower consumption. But in the medium term, they might be offset by certain things like regulatory easing, etc. On China, it's really not clear. I think we have to see how China retaliates. And so far, China has actually been quite restrained. So I think, if China retaliates, then, there's going to be, its exports are going to decline. Yeah, but its net imports are also going to decline. And net exports might not have an impact. And then, there's a Z-Trump meeting going on. There's side deals of, Chinese purchase of manufactured goods. And China has policy tools to offset any impact. So even the impact on China is not that straightforward. For rest of the world and including India, I think, first of all, I think the impact on the US and China itself important for India, because I think they're important trading partners for India. India is not that important for the US, but US is very important for India, and so is China. The first thing is to be clear about what the impact is going to be on the United States, what the impact is going to be on China, because they have, very important implications for India as well. The way I always think about tariffs is that, US adding tariffs, pushing back Chinese goods into the non-US global markets. And, that is potentially leading to dumping in other markets. And this will reduce India's competitiveness, not only in the American market, but also third markets globally. And of course, if China resorts to currency devaluation as a growth stimulus strategy, like the approach in the 1990s.
Like they did
and that could further
displace
demand for products from competitor countries like India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh.
On the other hand, our largest share of our imports are from China, so imports will be cheaper. So this sort of cuts a little bit both ways, right?
Correct.
So on the import side, China is our biggest trading partner. On exports, it's the United States.
Absolutely, I think, and there is a silver lining that is, behind all these dark clouds, because excess supply of Chinese goods outside the United States will reduce global prices. And will probably lead to lower inflation in the rest of the world. If you think about India specifically, which is, what we started with, I think the question is, the space which is vacated by countries which are directly targeted, maybe China in particular, how, could India capture some of the space? And as I said, I think India is despite being a labor abundant country, India has increasingly shifted towards capital intensive production in both, domestic production and exports. Think about electronics, engineering goods. We are no longer, the old age exports like textiles, etc., no longer are top exports. And this actually, the Trump could be an opportunity in this, to reorient and to aggressively really, expand labor-intensive manufacturing, especially in the sectors like textiles. And here, if I may say, the Convergence Foundation is a foundation based in Delhi, has done some excellent work on textiles. Basically, they say, four-pronged strategy for India to capitalize on this opportunity. I think expedite FTAs. I think some of it is already going on, but expediting some of these. I think second is reforming some of our labor regulations. If you think, again, we talked about Bihar. I think Bihar's per capita income is lower than Bangladesh. I think labor laws in Bihar are way more stringent. In Bangladesh, it's much easier to do different shifts for women to work, etc. In Bihar, I think both, minimum wages as well as regulations more generally are much more harder. Then, strengthening raw material ecosystems is a big thing. And creating, large-scale efficient special economic zones with comprehensive infrastructure. We have these PM Mitra parks, but again, scaling is important. I think in all this, I think positioning India in the global supply chain will be crucial because as, China continues to move up the value chain, as costs rise and competitiveness declines because of Trump or because of other reasons. If you think about the flying geese model of economic development, India has to identify where its comparative advantage lies, whether in upstream or downstream activity. So if you think about iPhone assembly, for example, see China earns about, $9-10 per unit, domestic value added, similar to what India earns. But the difference is that, China assembles 230 to 250 million units annually. India assembles about 30 to 40 million. The scale is really, I should point out that, India's recent budget actually moved, some of the custom duties you pointed out. I think it moved towards rationalizing some of the custom duties, they eliminating rates above 20% and reducing those above 70%. I think some moves, were taken. I think you're asking the right question. Could this shock be a trigger for some hard to achieve reforms? I think, and to build consensus on this. And I think I wrote somewhere that behind every challenge, there's a Trump opportunity.
Yeah. So, here, and, bear with me if I'm not phrasing this as precisely as one should. When I think about tariffs and I think about the two problems that you mentioned, right? So on one side, we need a raw material supply chain, which is increasingly more and more globalized. So we need to be plugged into global supply chains, right? Not just figure out our own cold storage and warehousing and things like that. Now, when we think about plugging into global supply chains, that requires large degree of rationalization of tariffs and low tariffs, right, overall. And the whole picking and choosing sector by sector, policy uncertainty over tariffs, that doesn't do well when it comes to trying to integrate that supply chain, especially on, low-end raw materials. On the other side of this problem is there is very good literature by you and many of your colleagues that find that there is an inverse relationship when you look at labor elasticities and the level of protectionism, right? So if we think about a place like Bihar or any relatively poor region in India which is now trying to scale, they would do better on wage elasticities and increase if there's greater protectionism, right? On the other hand, they would do better on kicking off new industry and plugging into supply chains and raw materials if the tariffs are relatively low and relatively certain. Is there a fundamental tension between these two things?
Shruti, I think overall what matters is competitiveness. I think that's how we should be thinking about it. How do we make, how do we get more competitive in, say, textiles or footwear or other labor-intensive manufacturing, and how we kill two birds with the same stone, that is, have, boost manufacturing as well as boost employment. So that's how I would think about it, rather than breaking it down into what is the tariffs, what is the impact of labor regulations, etc. So I think it's overall, I think the impact on competitiveness and how to make our firms more competitive. And I think size is important. Scale we talked about. I think we know that we know from a huge literature that larger firms are more productive. They tend to export more.
Yeah, we have a number of papers on that. Why we're not able to scale labor, why we're not able to scale on, electricity and power plants and things like that. But, on that part, I think at least the empirical history and what we can learn from countries that have actually advanced to the developed country stage, low tariffs and certain tariffs seems to be the number one ingredient for export competitiveness, right? One, because it'll keep, the price of imports relatively low, and two, because it forces domestic manufacturers to compete, which they don't do and will never do with protectionism. So then, would the policy prescription just be pick a number, ideally below 10, stick to it, doesn't matter what the rest of the world is doing, just stay competitive on tariffs?
So you have to balance external orientation and industrial policy. For example, if we are talking about textiles, we are talking about, footwear, we are talking about apparel. So I think, it's in India's interest to target sectors which are relatively labor intensive, because India is a labor abundant country. I think employment is a huge challenge. So it's okay to target sectors which are relatively more labor intensive. But at the same time, you have to have, external orientation in these sectors. So I think carefully balancing, I think it's very much a tightrope walk. Carefully balancing external orientation and industrial policy in this day and age is very, very important. And how to capitalize to your advantage, I think. So it's a more nuanced view of globalization in this world.
No, absolutely. But if I think about this from like a pure, now how do we conduct policy lens, would it just make sense to keep tariffs only in mind, for export competitiveness, keep them low, keep them very stable so that people can figure out their cost structures and plug into global value chains, right? That's kind of the idea of it. And any intervention you want on industrial policy side, do it through subsidies. Don't do it through tariffs, because tariffs seem to be a terrible lever to keep pulling on and off. And they also cause massive uncertainty, and it kind of makes people freeze in the tracks when they want to enter one of these businesses, which are enormously reliant on global value chains, right? And increasingly more and more businesses are reliant on global value chains. So is that the way to think about this? The nuanced approach would be keep it simple on tariffs. Domestic subsidies can adjust, ebb and flow with the tide.
Again, I want to take the example of textiles. I think you have to take into account, as you talk about supply chains, you have to take into account the input-output structure. So strengthening raw material ecosystems is very important. And for that, I think international trade costs need to be brought down, but also domestic costs need to be brought down. They're equally important. Again, that's what I mean by, carefully balancing, external orientation and industrial policy in this day and age. That is, you have to be very careful about the input-output structure. You have to be careful about international trade costs, but also domestic costs. And logistics costs. There's so much which goes on. So I think it needs again, it needs a very careful and nuanced approach, especially in this world. I think, especially in the world we are with all these geopolitical risks, uncertainty, how to use these to your advantages, and how to and I think it requires careful thinking.
Yeah, so it's a combination of tariff policies, subsidies, infrastructure, supply, and, sort of connecting the dots, making the country a one single trading unit by rationalizing GST. Like it's a really big bouquet of policies that you need to get right.
It's a comprehensive set of reforms, basically. And I think many times, for example, for textiles, the four things which I said. How India can capitalize on this, Trump opportunity, expedite FTAs, reform labor regulations, strengthen raw material ecosystems, create, large scale up SEZs with, comprehensive infrastructure. I think everything is known. It's not that, what I'm telling you is something new. But I think it's, how to overcome the implementation challenges. I think it's, so implement, I think is more likely to, go really in a big way to capitalize on this opportunity, really go. I think the implementation challenges are enormous.
Yeah. And one thing, I mean, this is a side tangent and not exactly what you were discussing. One of the things I find kind of complicated and messy when we do reforms in India is there's always a cluster of constraints, right? So it's not a single constraint. So labor law is one constraint, right? Tariffs, but it could be infrastructure, it could be SEZ, it could be contract enforcement. The problem is we are not always sure which is the binding constraint. So that's problem number one. And even when we know it's the binding constraint, let's say we reform a particular kind of contract enforcement, or we loosen labor regulation, or we loosen, the thresholds at which the labor regulation kicks in, right? Instead of 100 people, it's 300 people or whatever. The trouble is then that ceases to be the binding constraint and something else is the binding constraint. So you still don't see the results you need to see. So at some point, I think we need to get into some kind of like general equilibrium informed comprehensive reform program, which will remove a number of constraints or a cluster of constraints simultaneously, so that none of them end up becoming the binding constraint and then, industrial policy still doesn't take off. So that's how I view what's happening in India. We do like bit by bit tiny reforms and they just don't seem to land.
I think a lot is going on. I think, Shruti,
Yeah.
a lot is going on. I think when we start seeing in the numbers, especially on the manufacturing side, apparel exports, textile and apparel exports have increased dramatically.
Yeah.
But they still, the target is $100 billion or so by 20 in another 5 years. That seems like a tall order. So it does require a lot of coordination across the different ministries and departments, I think, to pull this together in a short. Again, 5 years, if you want to have a very large increase in manufacturing exports, I think a lot of coordination is required.
Yeah. So on the second part of what you've been writing about trade, especially, relevant a little bit more recently, is this question of, one, there's an upending of the global sort of like the globalization order, like the WTO order. And this is done in large part because of the labor issues in those countries domestically, including the United States, where for, I think, the last 5 presidential elections, the labor problems in the Rust Belt and the deindustrialization, all these have been very hot ticket political items. Simultaneously, in India, we need to increase both exports and we need job-led growth, right? First, can you tell us how to think about this problem for an emerging economy like India, where we do need to be part of the global trading order? We do need to increase our exports and our export competitiveness both. And we need to do it in a way that's, inclusive on jobs and the wages rise. So we have this multi-pronged problem in India. And how to think about that for India, and also how to think about that for the rest of the world, where everything is up in flames right now when it comes to the old order.
It's a good question, Shruti. I've been, doing with co-authors. We've been looking at this, what is the real reason globalization is under fire? Is it about globalization? I think Stiglitz, in one of his books, had said that it's not about globalization per se, but how it's managed. So what we are doing in some ongoing research is, if you think about it, the conventional economic case for globalization, that aggregate economic gains that these brings. For example, productivity, you talked about, expanding consumer choice, spurring technological change. But I think the critical aspect, which is often overlooked and which is actually very international trade 101, that globalization really inevitably creates winners and losers in the short term, even though long term, its effects are positive for the society. So, but the theoretical underpinning for these aggregate benefits to accrue is that losers can be compensated. However, in practice, they have not, globally, we have not succeeded in compensating the losers. So the benefits and costs of globalization have not been evenly distributed across, types of workers, industries, regions. And basically, this points to inadequate implementation of, some of the supportive policies, such as trade adjustment programs, social protection measures, regional development initiatives, even industrial policies. And therefore, I think what we are seeing, the significant social and political backlash against globalization, both in the US and globally, should not be very, surprising. This sentiment has become a decisive factor in elections after elections in the United States, but elsewhere as well. And you've heard all these terms, right? Fragmentation, deglobalization, globalization, offshoring, friendshoring. But the seeds of these were germinating way before US elections.
And they're all over Europe too. It's not just the US. This is a advanced economy phenomenon and it's everywhere.
Correct. So what we do is we put together a systematic database across a number of countries, and we evaluate policy approaches that have facilitated or hindered adjustment to globalization, trade shifts, technological change, and we study the China shock in particular. And we do find, as expected, that on average, many people have shown this, that, China shock can lead to deteriorating labor market outcomes in the manufacturing sector in particular. And we measure it by, higher job separation rates for prime age males, because manufacturing sector typically, across the world is quite intensive in male workers. But what is unique to this study is that we find that, countries where labor market mechanisms are stronger. I think these are countries where there are active labor market policies, training programs, skill development initiatives, employment subsidies, and passive labor market policies as well. Passive labor market policies are policies like unemployment insurance benefits. Countries where these support mechanisms are stronger, these experienced relatively smaller increases in job separation rates in response to the China shock. And we don't have much data outside the OECD for these labor market programs, with emerging markets, including India, I think have a lot of underinvestment. Even globally, I think it's the global median for this spending is much, I think it's below 1% of GDP. Is very small.
Yeah.
But I think even for India, I think if you look at, there are a few active programs. I think like, of course, Manrega is the big one, but the allocation for Manrega has declined quite a bit. It's at 0.2% of GDP. Other active programs are like PMKVY, DDU-GKY. There are a lot of, PMEGP, this for micro enterprise creation. They are very small. And we don't have much, data on passive labor market policies, but you can guess that, unemployment benefits, for example, is very small. 90% of jobs in India are informal. There's no social security benefits, and, workers have minimal support in between jobs. So if you really want to make, globalization politically sustainable, and even have successful sector-specific industrial policies, it really requires effectively managing transition costs for workers, and effectively managing this resistance to change. And this is coming back again and again in different reforms we try to implement. So there's urgent need for policies focused on reducing these transition costs, and likely through effective labor market programs.
So here there's a tension, right? One would expect that this would affect services and manufacturing the most, since those are the large share of exports, right? And also our services are more competitive when it comes to exports and some parts of manufacturing. But a very big problem in India's structural transformation is the exit from agriculture, which is unproductive to start with. So do the same sort of, labor adjustment programs that are designed towards trade, do they also work for the kind of structural transformation India needs to undergo now, because it's just reducing frictions in transition? Or is it like, do we need a new set of policies that target these two things separately?
Right. Generally, as I said, globally, if you look at, these policies are really small. I think even if you look at, countries like Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, they lead in spending on these active labor market programs. They are, allocating like 1.5% of GDP max. Median spending globally, or OECD country where we have data, is 0.3% of GDP. 90% of countries spend less than 0.7% of GDP. For a country like India, which is very populous, there's a huge population. 90% of the jobs are informal. They lack social security benefits. To implement these policies is even more, is very, very challenging. I think its challenge is really formidable for, countries with large population and substantial informal employment like India. So I think it's to talk about, such policies to aid transformation. I think maybe a bit far-fetched, and we have to start small. I think, agriculture itself, if you think about, labor-intensive sectors, or, sectors which, high-value agriculture, it could be actually quite a profitable sector for the country as a whole. And, I think there is a lot of potential there. Again, I think and very related to trade. India is the largest producer of pomegranate, but we hardly export any pomegranate. I think high value agriculture processing, food processing, allied activities. They can actually be create a lot of potential and be one of the you know uh, one of our star sectors if we solve again some of the
Scale issues.
scale issues and also some of the fundamental problems there in terms of again we have very stopgap policy on trade policy in agriculture. It's on and off policy for imports, for exports. So again and it doesn't, you can have any policy, but I think we don't need certainty in policies. So trade policy certainty is very, very important, which can, which can actually propel this sector, influence economic agents or whoever is the relevant entity to look for new markets, look for new products. So I think it's a high value agriculture, a little bit different view from what you said. High value agriculture can actually be a sector which can, which can be a big, which can be a big, again, big boost. So labor intensive, not manufacturing, but you can have labor intensive push to to agriculture, and in particular, and high value agriculture.
Yeah, and that would make me happy because that would mean I'll get mangoes, better and cheaper mangoes in the United States. And currently it's like for a couple of weeks and they're very expensive. On a more serious note, I want to talk to you also about how you think about the Indian rupee. There has been a lot of press around this, and this is very important for our overall trade and industrial policy. Is the rupee currently overvalued, undervalued? How do you perceive it?
Again, in my new role as an academic, I tend to go on the blackboard. I think number one, let's summarize what the evidence is on the exchange rates. Anybody who's been tracking India knows that INR has depreciated over time, right? Therefore, our policies must have allowed INR to depreciate. If you compare, I think it depends on what timeline you're looking at. If you look at a longer term picture, say compare pre-COVID and now, if you look at annual averages, which is perhaps the most appropriate way to look at it rather than you're looking at particular points of time. If you look at INR, US dollar, it's depreciated by rupee to the dollar, it's depreciated by about close to 20%. Nominal effective exchange rates, when you weight it by, you put trade weights to your trading partners and look at the exchange rates in a trade weighted term, that's nominal effective exchange rates, about 13% depreciation. In real terms, it's been flat, but of course, in real terms, this was also a period when our trading partners, advanced economies, and China as well, inflation had begun to decline. In the short run, I think there's been a lot of focus. I think if you compare 23-24, say January 23 to December 24, again, you look at the averages in these months, the rupee has also depreciated. It's about 4% against the dollar. If you look at against a broader basket, I think they're both strengthened. I think both nominal effective exchange rates and real effective exchange rates have strengthened. Real effective exchange rates have strengthened by 6.5%. Basically, again, real effective exchange rates reflects inflation movements in India's, trading partners relative to India's own inflation. Of course, if you look at 6 months, I think January to June 2023, the INR was more stable. But again, it was a short period of time. I think the question you asked, is it really overvalued? Again, what is the definition of overvaluation? It's in reference to an equilibrium. The different ways in which, you can compute the equilibrium. One of the ways typically, you compute it is you look at the current account, the current account deficit. I think I wrote a paper with Dr. C. Rangarajan, former head of the RBI.
He's been on the podcast. He's wonderful and talked about some of these themes.
I see. So we had estimated about 2.5% norm. I think maybe that norm has shifted, but if you think that that is the norm, I think currently your current account deficit is less. Current account deficit, we talked about it, right? Because of the huge services revolution and, services providing a cushion. Your current account deficit is running at 1.5%. So if your current account deficit is lower than what your norm is, then your exchange rate is actually undervalued, not overvalued.
Yeah.
But I think importantly, I think people always forget that, the norm itself changes.
Yeah.
Some people will look at the movement, say from, January 2023 to December 2024. As I said, 6% appreciation in real effective exchange rate. And you basically say that it's overvalued. Or if you look at, longer period between 2019 and 24 and assume that, assume 2019 is an equilibrium or 2023 is an equilibrium. But actually the equilibrium itself can shift.
Can shift.
And, this is the Balassa-Samuelson effect. So basically, if labor productivity of, if you look at developing countries, as labor productivity in the traded goods sector rises, spills over to wages and prices of non-traded goods, and it leads to an overall increase in price level of in the developing country. So as developing countries grow, their productivity improves. It could be a rising price or an appreciating currency could be an equilibrium phenomenon. So if the equilibrium itself shifts, even if you make an argument that the exchange rate is overvalued, it can't be overvalued by that much.
No, and also, one, the equilibrium shifts, and second, the policy priorities in an emerging economy also shift. So if I remember correctly, you have this paper with, I think, Sajid Chinoy, and I'm forgetting the other author's name, I apologize, where you talk about how export transference of the exchange rate itself has reduced over a period of time. And this is because now, over a period of time, more and more intermediate goods need to be imported for manufacturing. So you can't have this problem which impacts certain parts of the economy too much, right? So even on that, the policy priority also seems to have shifted with the equilibrium.
Absolutely. So this is a paper joined with Sajid Chuna and Siddharth Nath, who was the
Yes,
staff,
thank you for that.
of
Sorry,
the
I'm sorry about
RBI.
that.
And we basically document very two major transformations in Indian exports. One is the move from manufacturing to services, which we know, services is really providing a big cushion to the current account of India. And the other is within manufacturing, which I talked about, movement towards more capital intensive products like engineering, electronic goods. And then we go on to see what the impact of exchange rate is going to be. So, of course, there is some elasticity of exchange rate. There's some elasticity of exports and output to exchange rate. But the fact that, exports are becoming more intensive, as you talked about, more intensive in this iPhone or, anything on your table is not a good from any particular country, because the intermediate inputs are from everywhere else. And if you think about it, if the exchange rate depreciates, the intermediate inputs become more expensive.
Yeah.
So the standard you don't get a kick to competitiveness. The standard, competitiveness kick is not there. And that's what so of course there's elasticity, but I think given that, exports are becoming increasingly intensive in imports, I think that elasticity is probably lower than what we thought.
Another big change has been in foreign exchange reserves. Again, this has been covered in enormous detail in the press. The liberalization was born out of a crisis of foreign exchange reserves, right? So historically, the way Indian central bankers thought about it is we need to really have a big buildup of reserves. The more we trade, the more robust and stable our reserves need to be. Question one, has that old thinking undergone a shift in some meaningful way? And second, how do you view RBI's reserves policy over, say, the last 18 to 24 months?
I think over a longer period, I think I always, I think if you think about it again, go back to the blackboard. I think holding foreign exchange reserves entails both costs and benefits. And the benefits are that, they're liquidity buffers, they smooth against external shocks. You can smooth external shocks without destructive output adjustments. And generally, there is a literature which establishes that if you have emerging markets, if you have adequate reserve holdings, they generally, ahead of the global financial crisis, for example, they suffered smaller output and consumption declines. But carrying reserves also entails costs, such as, you are sacrificing some interest. So you can use different approaches to see whether, foreign exchange reserves are adequate. And I think it's work done by my team at the RBI, which included, I think, Siddharth Nath and also Rajiv Das. We put the system to certain stresses, and you can estimate a model actually and see you calibrate an optimization model. The very famous paper by Olivier Jarre and Romain Rancière.
Yeah.
And basically you apply that to India. It's basically it showed that India supported the hypothesis that India's foreign exchange reserves are adequate to cover potential stress scenarios. And if you look at, you can do a simple regression analysis where you can look at what drives India's reserve holdings. And it does seem to be the case that it's explained largely by precautionary motives, of reserve accumulation in light of its, growing external sector openness and associated risks.
But it's been a while since you wrote that paper. So
actually, I did not write that paper. It was more the team at the RBI who wrote the paper. But I think it's, I would say that paper is even more relevant given all the geopolitical uncertainty, etc., which we've seen. I think the demand for reserves for precautionary motives is probably even higher, and we've gone a long way, right? Back 20, if you go back a decade or so ago, 2013, 14, compare it to now, I think we have accumulated more reserves. More recently, I think due to the intervention which you pointed out, we've lost, I think foreign exchange reserves have been reduced. But I think this is, day-to-day functioning of any central bank based on what's happening globally, what's happening, we've had, record equity outflows over the last couple of months.
But everything you're telling me points towards we should be more careful about reserves and not less careful about it or deplete reserves, right? Am I reading what you're telling me correctly?
Right. But I think we are not, I don't think we are I think there is any, again, I'm not, I don't think we are depleting reserves. I think we're still, I think as I said, if you would redo the analysis, the demand for reserves would still be quite high because of precautionary reasons. And, if you look at, if you compare, standard metrics of reserve holdings, I think we would still be, there's certain rules of the thumb for reserve adequacy. I think we would be way beyond, I think, those rules of the thumb. But of course, I think, you also have to manage, macroeconomic management has been very challenging, for several reasons. I think as, global context has changed a lot. We've had record equity outflows, as I mentioned, particularly from the equity market, and domestic slowdown. So a combination of that does require firefighting and reducing volatility in the exchange rate, which is more an outcome of a number of exchange rate is just a symptom. It's a relative price, right?
Yeah.
And I think the recent reduction in reserves is mostly to it's more, I think, firefighting in the current global and domestic scenario, I would say. But longer term, I think the thinking, in my view, is still the same. I think that is holding foreign exchange reserves entails both benefits and costs. These are all the benefits. We know from the evidence that if a crisis hits, you have smaller output and consumption declines if you have higher reserves, and balanced against the costs of holding reserves. I think that's what you have as what you see as the outcome of reserves.
And, related to this is the question of capital mobility and capital inflows. So we've had quite a bit of volatility since, I would say, the COVID pandemic particularly, right? So we had massive inflows in 2020, 2021 as the US Fed started dramatically, reducing rates and so on. We've seen a big capital flight, or at least that's how all the panicked people are writing about it in, say, the last 18 to 24 months. What is a good way to think about how to manage capital mobility from the point of view of the central bank in India, given the, extreme global uncertainty right now?
Right. I think, as you correctly pointed out, I think the recent depreciation pressures on the INR have been related to record capital outflows, particularly most of it has been from equity markets. It's related to, I think, three global factors. One is we saw dollar appreciation following when US administration took over. So markets were expecting, higher tariffs would be associated with higher inflation and higher rates. And that's why you had, dollar appreciation. Number two, amidst all this geopolitical uncertainty, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, US is still a safe haven for investors. And by the way, US yields running at 4%. Why would an investor is like, if you invest in a emerging economy, I think, and you have to adjust for depreciation, US assets are not giving, are giving equal or, higher yield, especially, safe is a safe haven. And third is a China factor. Investors are actually reallocating assets towards China because, DeepSeek AI has been a big positive technology shock. Actually, some of these factors are already reversing. So we'll find out more on April 2nd, but I think reciprocal tariffs are most likely now. And the probability of US recession is higher. And the outlook on Europe is brighter now. So we're actually seeing some of the dollar gains reversing and, strengthening of INR from the lows. So I think the bottom line, I think, is a challenging situation for domestic macroeconomic management. I think compounded with all the domestic issues, the slowdown which we talked about, etc. I think, the authorities have been focused on domestic output and domestic inflation.
Yeah.
To the extent that all these events feed into domestic output and domestic inflation, I think there is a need. We are an inflation targeting regime, so I think we have price stability is the mandate, while keeping into consideration growth. So I think that's been, the philosophy as far as I can see it.
So, I have a slightly nerdier question about the Mendelian trilemma in international finance. And this is, of course, the Cliff Notes version is where an economy, or rather a central banker, has to choose between free capital mobility, fixing the exchange rate, or autonomy over monetary policy. And the way the trilemma is set up is that any central banker or authority can only do two out of the three. All three can't be done simultaneously, and it's near impossible. And the way I think about how India has done this is India has not exactly picked two out of the three, but it's tried to prioritize one or two out of these three different prongs at various points in time, right? The US, until very recently, was very clear on this. They chose free capital mobility and autonomy over monetary policy, right? And the dollar was really set in the international market freely. India is not that. How do you see the current version of this trilemma playing out in India? Has it changed substantially in the last decade or so? What is the current challenge that the RBI is facing?
Basically, the big change is that now we are an inflation targeting regime. I think we introduced inflation targeting back in 2014. I think it was legislated in the law, I think 2016, 17. But I think we moved to an inflation targeting regime back in 2014. And I think that has been the big change. So we are in a regime of flexible inflation targeting. And I think inflation has declined sharply. I think we were double digits a decade ago. The latest reading was at 3.6%. We've gone a long way.
Yeah. So our targeting regime, just for the listeners, is a 4% with a 2% band.
Right. It's 4% plus minus 2%. So, and this has, indefinitely it has contributed. But if you ask me if this is the only factor, that is, probably not. I think, again, my paper with Sajid Chinoy and Pankaj Kumar, the staff at RBI, I think we show that Indian evolution of inflation is a very complex mix of a number of things. State of the business cycle, inflation expectation, global factors, institutional structures.
Agriculture, weather, we have so many things going on.
Correct. So exogenous shocks to inflation, if, for example, from, say, MSP or discretionary component of MSP, as we call it, a new monetary regime, commodity prices came down. They were all perpetuated through backward-looking expectations and domestic institutional structures. And that amplified the influence of original shocks. I'm not sure if it's bumbo jumbo, but basically, there were a number of these complex factors which brought inflation down. And and of course, that coincided with the inflation targeting regime.
So how do you view the performance of this regime in the last 10 years, right? So now we have about 10 years of evidence. Of course, there have been some serious supply side shocks. Like we've had the pandemic disruption, which was enormous. We've had GST rollout, which, is not that critical, but it did affect many, many, many different sectors and parts of the Indian economy across states. And overall, there has been a bit of a growth slowdown globally, and therefore it's also found its way into India. So what is a good way to think about the performance just of the inflation targeting regime?
Well, I think, the inflation targeting regime, if you go actually into the law, it's about, price stability at the same time keeping growth in consideration. So if you look at, so price stability is the primary objective. If you look at, as I said, headline inflation headline CPI, consumer price index inflation, was in double digits. The latest reading was 3.6%.
Yeah.
So definitely, I think this is, we've gone a long way.
Yeah.
What is striking is that, core inflation has also declined sharply.
Yeah.
So it's about 200 basis points over the last 2 years. In macroeconomics, this is really, if core inflation is declining, it's also an indication of a negative output gap. And this relates to everything we talked about, demand being the constraint in a cyclical sense.
Yeah.
So I think that's how I would summarize it. As I said, if it's only the inflation targeting regime, I don't think so. I think it's a combination of a number of factors, because inflation in India is a very complex mix of a number of things. Yeah. In that paper I mentioned, the paper is a bit dated because we're looking at the dramatic decline in inflation initially, once around, I think this paper came out 2016, 2017, and we actually quantify some of the factors. And I think I mean, it would be good exercise for any PhD student to update that and see, how that.
Yeah, because oil prices have completely changed. Like, there are so many parts of that mix which have
No,
changed
because
quite
yeah,
dramatically.
absolutely. That time people were saying that it's only good luck.
Yeah.
We say that, look, it's a combination of different things,
Yeah.
even inflation expectations, global factors, institutional structures, everything played together and brought inflation down. But I think the fact that core inflation has declined dramatically as well, I think is something which needs thought. And what does it mean? Is it an indication of negative output gap? How much is output below potential? How much demand is deficient, and what kind of demand is deficient? How does it relate to the employment problem and all? Everything we need to put the different parts of the jigsaw puzzle together.
So the way I think about it is, I think the MPC and the inflation targeting regime, they've done remarkably well for their core project, which was to bring inflation down. Has it happened at the cost of growth, or is most of that got to do with all these other global events and pandemic shocks and all of that other stuff? What's a good way to think about that? How would you even begin parsing it out? I guess that's the question.
See, I think growth has averaged about 6.5% over the last 2 decades. I think that's where we have been, in a sense. So if you look at a longer term perspective, it's not that we've sacrificed growth to reduce inflation. Again, if you're looking at a cyclical perspective, I think it's you have to look at where the output gap is and how far are you from potential, and how much is the demand deficiency, etc.
Got it. One other thing that, in particular, Prime Minister Modi, I think this has a lot to do with sort of his view of the world. He is very particular about keeping inflation down, and he's talked about this in a lot of speeches. The other is he really cares about being fiscally prudent and keeping deficits low. So, normally Prime Ministers don't talk about these things in like just a regular speech, but this keeps coming up in Prime Minister Modi's general narrative about how much he cares about keeping spending and deficits low. In fact, India was one of the few emerging economies that didn't go crazy during the pandemic or the post-pandemic recovery and so on. What is a good way to think about India's recent fiscal consolidation? So, I want you to answer this maybe in two parts. One, both how you see this has played out in India, and also you've done some very recent work with co-authors where you distinguish between discretionary fiscal consolidation and durable fiscal consolidation. The big question for me is, how has India performed in its fiscal consolidation, let's say over the last decade? Because there's been a huge effort made towards keeping deficits low and towards broader fiscal consolidation, thinking about disinvestment, thinking about reducing the debt to GDP ratio and so on and so forth. So how do you view what's happening in India?
One is the most salient feature of this whole fiscal framework during the last decade is that fiscal consolidation has remained the primary focus. We gave a stimulus during COVID, but much smaller than advanced economies gave. And importantly, the stimulus did not last long, and we started normalizing very quickly. So we've had about 200 basis points of tightening since FY21. And that's why, we've seen some of the growth slow down, cyclical slowdown attributable to that. Second is that, budget after budget, you have the commitment to fiscal consolidation is really underpinned by conservative assumptions. For example, in the most recent budget, we have a projected nominal GDP growth of 10% and tax buoyancy assumptions, which are also reasonable. Third is the quality of spending has improved because ratio of capital to current spending has increased a lot. I mean, if you compare over the last couple of years, we've gone from 20 to 30%. And in fact, a lot of commentators were saying that central capex has really hit the ceiling in this budget. But actually, the budget, if you look at some of the details, is freeing space, fiscal space, by cutting some of the inefficient revenue expenditure items. That said, I think there is still many challenges. India's sovereign debt situation is still remains a concern. It's sovereign debt to GDP is about 84%. This is basically an outcome of this is the high burden of interest payments. For the central government, it's 37% of revenues, which is very high. If you look at interest payments, how much they constitute the fiscal deficit. So if you exclude interest payments, India's primary deficit is actually quite small. It's only 0.8% of GDP. So we spend a lot of our resources in actually making interest payments on existing debt. And therefore, I think this requires, again, careful deleveraging and also to improve sovereign ratings. which would, if you have if you're deleveraging, that can improve sovereign ratings and create space for development initiatives. And and let me just digress a little bit to this topic of credit rating agencies, because I also have been working on a research project on sovereign credit rating agencies. And the fact of the matter is, even if it's not fully clear how they decide their ratings still strongly influence how much foreign money flows into a country and how likely a country is to repay its debt. And stock of debt as a fraction of GDP remains an important ingredient of its rating model. So we've been looking at it again. I've been looking at it with co-authors Olivier Blanchard and Daniel Lee, where we are looking at future fiscal prospects. For example, India is committed to a path of fiscal consolidation versus the stock of debt. It turns out that rating agencies put much more weight on your existing stock or the past, accumulation of past deficits compared to future fiscal prospects. So I think it's important to engage with them and understand why they give more weight and what that implies for rating agencies itself. I think if you want a more fuller picture of of sovereign risk, as well as a more accurate predictor of foreign inflows into an economy, why is it that if I'm fully committed to fiscal consolidation going forward, why is it that rating agencies do not weight it as much?
So there are two ways to think about what you just said, and I want to connect your work both on fiscal consolidation and sovereign credit ratings. So one way to think about it is they don't weight it quite as much because interest payments keep ballooning, right? And that is not changing unless someone just writes that off, which is also not ideal for sovereign credit ratings. So is that the big part of it, or is it because they want to see a very strong track record of durability in fiscal consolidation before that informs the credit rating? And in your other work with co-authors, you find that, this discretionary fiscal consolidation, right, which countries do, in a one-off way, either by dramatically reducing spending in particular part of the business cycle or by selling off assets, that may bring down the debt to GDP ratio for like a small fraction in time and so on. You find that doesn't seem to matter as much as a more slow, steady approach, which gives you much better durable reduction in debt to GDP. So are these two things connected, or am I just connecting them because you've just written both these papers?
I think you raised an important question. Why is it that? And this is what we are struggling with. Why is it that rating agencies give, so much more weight to your past sins, so to say, than to your future fiscal prospects? And remember that this is, controlling for your accumulated stock of debt. They don't give as much weight. So it's not because, they are, that the interest payments are going, what you're saying, that interest payments are going to, because you're controlling
Fair.
for that.
You're controlling for that.
Yeah.
Fair.
So controlling for your past stock of debt, they don't value it as much. And interestingly, they don't value it compared to what markets do, compared to what a theoretical model is suggesting, a simple theoretical model. But I think compared to what markets, we look at spreads as well. We look at sovereign spreads across a large number of countries. And rating agencies don't give as much weight to future fiscal performance compared to the theoretical model, but also compared to what markets tend to weigh future fiscal prospects way more. So if a country is committed to a future path of fiscal consolidation, markets tend to weigh way more. I don't have an answer for why this is the case, but I think what is puzzling is it's not a theoretical construct because it's also relative to what the markets are suggesting. Coming to your second question on discretionary fiscal consolidation, why that might not always reduce debt to GDP is debt to GDP is, debt in the numerator, GDP in the denominator. So while discretionary fiscal consolidation is like, you're cutting transfers, you're cutting unnecessary expenditures, etc. Normally you would reduce the numerator, the stock of debt would reduce. But generally, macroeconomic sense, you also reduce aggregate demand. So GDP would also reduce. And that's why the ratio, it's not always true that, the ratio discretionary fiscal consolidation always reduces debt to GDP. It's not always true. You have to do it in the right condition, globally right conditions, domestically right conditions. When the world is doing better, when the domestic economy is doing better, when there's less volatility, that's the time to consolidate. That's the time to build buffers. I think that's what the paper is about.
Yeah, and also the signal sent through consistency, right? So if you very systematically embrace fiscal consolidation, then presumably the rest of the world also responds to that, the market responds to that, and the denominator will increase.
Right. I think so. Of course, credible fiscal consolidation can increase confidence, can actually increase GDP. And this effect could outweigh the standard macroeconomic channel where you cut aggregate demand and you reduce GDP.
Yeah, that's how I read the paper. So, so that takes time, basically. Yeah. Again, Prachi, it's so late for you. We haven't covered even half your academic research. So I really hope you will come back to talk about all your work on monetary policy and other countries and so on. And even fiscal policy. Actually, we barely, scratched the tip of the iceberg. But thank you so much for doing this. This was a real pleasure. And I really enjoyed speaking with you.
My pleasure, Shruti. I look forward to interacting with you in the future.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.